A few hours ago, my mom said, if you don't have enough money, then stay home. A few hours later, I saw my card swiped for a family trip to Hawaii, without me. I'm Natalie Brooks, 33 years old, a branch manager at a bank in Chicago. Today was supposed to be nothing more than wrapping up the quarterly report and making it home in time for dinner. But the spending alert flashing on my phone froze me in place right there in the conference room. The cold white light from the glass walls spilled across my face, highlighting every tense muscle. I can still hear my mom's words ringing in my head, sharper than the hum of the contract printer beside me. If you don't have enough money, then stay home. For someone who manages a bank, those words felt like a slap in the face. And the worst part, they came from my own family. Before I tell you what really happened, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit like if you've ever felt like nothing more than your family's endless ATM. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. I was born and raised in a family that believed appearances mattered more than the truth. Our house always smelled of scented candles, the living room filled with fresh flowers, picture frames arranged so anyone walking in would say, "Now this is a perfect family." There was only one crooked frame I intentionally never straightened, my parents standing proudly in the center, my sister Lily radiant like a star, and me, off to the side, forcing a smile. Every time I came home, I'd pause in front of that photo as if it were a ritual, a reminder that my place in the family had always been slightly off. From a young age, I was different from them. I loved numbers, balance sheets, the feeling of everything matching up. My parents and Lily loved the stage, the spotlight, compliments from strangers. My mother used to say, a girl should know how to shine. I'd ask, with what? She'd smile, with everything people can see. That answer followed me throughout my childhood, an invisible yardstick. What can't be seen doesn't matter. Lily grew up like sunlight in the middle of our living room, always met with, "She's as pretty as a doll." I, on the other hand, was given the practical jobs. By 17, I knew the route to the post office by heart to pay the electric, water, and cable bills whenever my parents were too busy. Once, my macroeconomics midterm fell on the same day as the power bill deadline. I left class early, ran to the bank, waited in a line so long I was short of breath, then got back to school 10 minutes late. My professor looked at me, sighed, allowed me to submit late but docked points. That night, when I told the story, my father didn't ask why. He just looked at me and said, as if praising me, "You're not the prettiest in the family, but you'll definitely make the most money." I smiled politely and quietly went to my room. I remember the weekends Lily went prom dress shopping, my mother carefully choosing each layer of lace, while I stood waiting to pay the deposit for the family photo studio because my parents forgot to bring a card. On Thanksgiving night, guests complimented the table as so classy, and my mother winked at me, "See? Keeping up appearances is the most important thing." Meanwhile, I sat counting the catering bill, the chair rental, the delivery fee. The numbers lined up neatly. My feelings had no place to fit. I studied finance, the only thing that made me feel at peace. My parents didn't approve. They wanted me in communications or event management. You'd be better on stage introducing programs than sitting behind a keyboard. I just shook my head. I wanted to understand how money moved, to help people manage risk, to watch a balance sheet turn from red to black. The day I landed an internship at a major bank, my mother shrugged, so dry. "Aren't you afraid you'll become boring?" I almost said that. To me, honesty and transparency aren't boring, but I stayed silent. In my house, truth was often considered a buzzkill. The older Lily got, the more she was favored. A career stumble? She's still young. A bad choice in love? Men make mistakes. A parking ticket? Nat, can you cover this for your sister? Everything flowed smoothly as if the family budget had an endless stream named after me. When I refused an expensive pair of shoes my mother offered, she smirked, "You're always so practical." I didn't argue. I just thought being practical is a way of being honest, at least with yourself. When I got a full-time job at the bank, I thought my parents would finally see me as impressive enough. They didn't. They saw someone with a stable income who could quietly absorb the inconvenient expenses. I started keeping a separate notebook labeled Family Expenses. A black cover, papers clipped neatly, each expense recorded with date, reason, and who requested it. I wasn't the family's accountant, but I became the keeper of receipts no one wanted to look at. Memories kept resurfacing in small details. My father always told me, "Be gentle, don't make people lose face," whenever I spoke plainly. Once, I blurted out that my aunt's limited edition purse looked like an end-of-season market find. My mother pulled me into the kitchen, whispering through clenched teeth, "Can't you be less blunt? We need harmony." That's when I realized, in this family, truth must always lose to a polished facade. In family photos, I often stood on the edge. Not because anyone pushed me there, but because there were so many things to get perfect before the shutter clicked. Lily in the middle, dress unwrinkled, my parents shoulder to shoulder, posture straight, flowers placed to fill the frame. When everything was perfect, someone would turn and say, "Nat, take the picture." I'd step back, lift the camera, frame it, count 1, 2, 3. The photo turned out perfect. Missing only the person holding the camera. I can still hear my voice in college. "I want to stay in the lab tonight, I like working with data." My mother sighed, "Don't you see your friends going out? A girl shouldn't be so dry." I wasn't dry. I just didn't know how to put lipstick on my feelings like they did with their lives. And when I was honest, I became the one who ruined the mood. Later, when Lily married Derek, it all became clearer. My family threw a movie-perfect wedding, golden lights, white flowers, soft music. I was at the cashier's desk, checking an invoice where the venue had mistakenly charged us for an extra set of candles. When I returned, the ceremony was underway, and someone grabbed my hand, pulling me backstage. "Nat, sign the group card, don't let it go without your name." I smiled, signed, and overheard my mother whisper, "Don't ruin the family image in front of the guests." I just nodded. Maybe I belonged more in the shadows backstage than under their spotlight. Tonight, in my own apartment, I stood in front of that crooked frame longer than usual. The warm light made the photo look aged, my face still as strained as the day it was taken. I reached up to straighten the wooden edge. Then I stopped. Lowered my hand. The crookedness was one of the few truths left untouched in that house. I was always on the fringe, carrying what others didn't want to see, saying what others didn't want to hear. My phone buzzed. Lily sent a screenshot of an e-ticket, a winking smiley face. No words. My name wasn't on the passenger list. Another notification overlaid it. My credit card had just been held for a large sum. I didn't open it right away. I poured some water, leaned back in my chair, and stared at the ceiling. In my head, memories ran like a long bank statement: my sister's tuition, my father's hospital bills, roof repairs after the storm, party fees to save face. The closing line at the bottom was a single word: silence. I no longer blamed them for favoritism. It was simply the blueprint of my family. My mother loved appearances, my father needed honor, Lily lived to be admired. And me. I was told to be real, but punished whenever I spoke the truth. I had tried to stand firm, to be a pillar, hoping they'd one day see me. Turns out, the sturdier I stood, the more I was used as something to lean on. I stood up and turned off most of the lights. The room sank into its familiar quiet. Outside, Chicago exhaled cold gusts. I glanced once more at the crooked frame, suddenly amused. I used to think that if I just straightened it, everything would look better. But life doesn't straighten just because you nudge the edge of a frame. And the Hawaii charge was that drop. That morning, Chicago was freezing. I left my apartment while the sun was still hiding behind the glass towers, my breath turning into thin wisps in the air. Mom called as I was walking across the parking lot dusted with frost. Her voice was flat, without a trace of warmth. If you don't have enough money, just stay home and don't waste it. No greeting, no preamble. I stopped in my tracks, my hand tightening around my bag strap. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but I swallowed the words. The chill from the pavement seemed to crawl straight into my chest. A few hours later, while reviewing the balance sheet for a major client, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a transaction alert: first-class airline tickets, 4 passengers, Honolulu. Passenger names: Dad, Mom, Lily, and Derek. Not me. The cursor on my computer screen froze. Outside the window, snow began to fall in light flurries, white specks clinging to the glass in front of me, blurring each time I exhaled. I opened the transaction details. The amount was enough to cover 3 months of my rent. The card they charged was the one I reserved for emergency family expenses, but this time, no one had asked first, no one had even informed me. No text. No call. As if I were an invisible ATM, dispensing cash at the push of a button. I didn't call back. I didn't text. I opened my banking app, froze the card, and filed for a refund. My finger tapped confirm, a clean, final motion, like cutting through a worn-out cord. Outside, the snow was falling heavier now, each flake tapping softly against the glass before melting into streaks that slid downward. In the quiet office, the printer kept whirring steadily. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on my phone's darkened screen, reflecting a face unnervingly calm. Not because I wasn't angry, but because the anger had gone past the point of eruption, settling into something smoldering, burning low and deep in my chest. I thought about Mom's words that morning: if you don't have enough money, just stay home. For a bank manager like me, to have my own mother imply I couldn't afford something, only for them to use my money hours later to buy first-class tickets, it was a paradox that landed like a second slap, harder than the first. I stood and walked to the window. With one finger, I traced a small circle into the cold glass, the outside world a blur of white. Since I was little, I'd been used to watching winter from behind a window, close enough to see, far enough to be apart. But this time, I understood something: if they already saw me as a machine, then this machine just pulled the plug. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and kept working. But each figure on the spreadsheet seemed to add another layer of weight to my mind. My client's balance sheet still lined up perfectly. The balance sheet of my relationship with my family had been in the red for a long time. My phone lit up again. A message from Lily, Hawaii, no explanation. I left it unopened. I knew if I did, I'd see photos of hotel rooms, beaches, and cocktails by the pool, images that would once again be charged to my account, in every sense of the word. I locked my phone, set it down, and drew in a slow breath. Around me, the faint scent of coffee and the sound of keyboards blended into the office air. But inside me, there was another sound, the slam of an invisible door. I knew this wasn't just about the money. This was a line. And once they crossed it, I wasn't going back. That evening, I had just set my bag down on the table when my phone rang. The screen lit up with the word home, the same number my parents had used for over 20 years. For a moment, I considered not picking up. But my finger swiped up out of habit. Hello? No greeting. Just the sound of heavy breathing, then my father's voice came through, hard and heavy like a hammer. What the hell did you just do? I hadn't even processed his words when he went on, voice rising. Locking the card? Reversing the payment? Do you have any idea how much that embarrassed the family? I drew in a slow breath, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad, But before I could finish, my mother snatched the phone. Her voice was ice cold, stripped of any warmth. "So you just planned to leave the whole family stranded? Who even invited you back into this family just so you could act like this?" I froze, the words catching in my throat like a swallowed stone. "I just wanted to ask why you." "No need to ask," my mother cut in, each word clipped and sharp. "Family money is for the family. If you're not grown up enough to understand that, then stop calling yourself our daughter." My father jumped back in, his voice thick with threat. "You think you're so smart? If you ever pull something like this again, don't blame us for telling everyone exactly what kind of person you are." I stood motionless in my dark apartment, the only sound in my ears the pounding of my own blood. 100 questions swirled in my head, but my throat felt like it was clamped shut. My mother spoke again, her tone drawn out, dripping with mockery. "A banker acting like a thief. Shameful." That landed heavier than any bill I had ever paid on their behalf. I said nothing. My father hung up with a dry, final click. Not 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from a friend. "Nat, have you seen Lily's status yet?" Along with a screenshot. On Facebook, Lily had written, "Some people think holding on to money is more important than holding on to relationships. Good thing the salty sea breeze in Hawaii washes away the smell of cash." No tag, but everyone knew who she meant. Below it were over 200 likes, along with mocking comments and laughing emojis. Someone had even added, "Must be hard having a sister like that in the family." I turned off the screen and set the phone down. But the notifications kept blinking, as if the whole outside world was talking about me while I was locked in this small apartment. The next morning, I walked into the office. A few coworkers' eyes met mine, then darted away. The air felt dense, heavy. Before I could sit down, my manager stopped by my desk. "Nat, can I see you in my office for a moment?" Once the door closed, he set a stack of papers on the table, lowering his voice. "There's a rumor going around that you've been embezzling client funds, transferring them to your personal account for your own spending." I let out a short, dry laugh with no trace of humor. "You've got to be kidding me." He shook his head. "The source seems to be someone in your family." It felt like someone had just sucked all the air out of the room. I stood, thanked him, and walked out. My heels struck the hallway floor with a cold, echoing rhythm. I went straight into the company restroom and locked the door behind me. Cold water poured over my hands, seeping between my fingers, swirling down the white porcelain sink. I lowered my head, letting the water splash over my skin, as if it could wash away the grime clinging to me since last night. When I looked up, my eyes were red, not from crying, but from staring into the face in the mirror, trying to confirm it was still me. The woman who once believed that hard work and honesty were enough to earn respect. Water dripped from the faucet into the sink, each drop ticking like a countdown. I knew this was no longer about money. This was a line that had been crossed, a cut that no apology could mend. Family never hurts each other, unless they're my family. I turned off the tap, dried my hands, and drew a deep breath. By the time I stepped back out, my face was as smooth and still as a lake. But beneath the surface, the undercurrent had already begun to rise. And this time, I wasn't going to let them win. But before the anger could cool, the storm hit. That night, I opened my laptop and created a new Excel file. The blue glow from the screen reflected in my eyes, wide and unblinking after days without proper sleep. My fingers flew across the keyboard, filling each cell: Lily's tuition, $48,000 for 4 years of college. Dad's hospital bills, $22,300 after his heart surgery. Roof repairs after the hurricane, $17,500. Countless smaller expenses, utility bills, mom's car repairs, deposits for family vacations I never attended, all neatly arranged in 12 columns. The final number landed at $124,682. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the spreadsheet as if it were a diary written in numbers. Each sum wasn't just a transaction, it was a memory. The day Lily called me sobbing because her tuition was late, I was in a meeting and still slipped out to the parking lot to transfer the money. When Dad was in the hospital, I canceled an important business trip to sign the guarantor paperwork in the ER. Even the roof repairs, I knew they'd never thank me, but I still wanted them to sleep soundly when it rained. I gathered every receipt and printed them out. The printer whirred, spitting warm sheets into my hands. Each page was a piece of evidence. I stacked them in chronological order, clipped them into a thick bundle, and wrote on the cover, "Statement, 2015 to present." When everything was ready, I opened an email, attached the file, and typed briefly. "Dear Mom and Dad, here is the full list of expenses I've covered for the family over the past 8 years. Total, $124,682. I'm sending this so you're aware. Natalie." I hit send. Outside the window, the night wind rustled through the trees, the sound of leaves brushing like sheets of paper. Less than an hour later, Mom's reply appeared. Just one sentence. "That's your duty." Before I could exhale, my phone rang. "Dad." I switched on the recorder, then answered. "Are you trying to turn this family into a ledger?" His voice was heavy as stone. "I just want everything to be clear, from now. Family doesn't keep score." He cut me off. "What's with adding up every penny like you're an outsider? If you still remember you're a Brooks, don't you ever send something like this again?" I looked at the bundle of receipts on the table. The ceiling fan stirred a thin layer of dust into the warm yellow light. "Dad," I said slowly, "from today on, we're counting every cent." Silence on the other end, then the sound of his heavy breathing before he hung up. I sat there, realizing my voice hadn't wavered, my hands hadn't gone cold. The roaring anger of the past few days had hardened into something else, a quiet resolve, solid as bedrock. I placed all the receipts into a file folder, locked it, and slid it into my desk drawer. This time, I wasn't just keeping proof. I was keeping my boundaries. Close to midnight, pounding rattled my door, mixed with Mom's shrill voice. "Open the door, Natalie!" Before I could get up, the lock turned and the door flew open. My parents stormed in, the winter chill flooding my small apartment. "Who do you think you are, sending that disgraceful thing?" Mom's voice dripped venom as she stepped closer. Before I could answer, Dad came forward and struck my face hard enough to make stars burst in my vision. My ears rang, but his voice still cut through, each word tearing the air apart. "Useless! We only use you for your money?" "Yes. Because you're worth nothing else. We should never have had you. You don't deserve to be alive." I froze. The sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the tearing inside my chest. Mom gave me one last contemptuous glance before turning away. Dad followed. The door slammed so hard the frame shook. In my hand, the recorder's red light still glowed, every word they had said was saved, sharp as a blade carving deep. I walked to my bedroom, still in my clothes, and lay on my back. The streetlight streamed through the gap in the curtains, spilling a pale yellow stripe across my pillow. I lay still, not shedding a single tear, just listening to the slow thud of my heartbeat, each one asking, how much longer, until I'm free of them? After what was said that night, it felt like my emotions had been drained dry. I knew I had to do something more decisive, not to prove anything to them, but to save myself, the one they had cast aside. and it seemed the universe was quietly on my side. 3 days later, I received a text from an unknown number. "Natalie? This is Sophie, Derek's ex-wife. We need to talk." I hesitated for a moment. The name Sophie was tied to little stories Lily used to tell, always laced with that condescending tone. She just didn't know how to keep a man. But then I replied, "All right." We agreed to meet at a small cafe at the end of the street. Outside, snow was still drifting down. Sophie arrived in a gray knit coat, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes carrying the weight of too many storms. She didn't waste time. Sitting down, Sophie placed a thick envelope in front of me. I opened it. Paper slid out of the envelope and fell onto the wooden table, a few sheets fanning out as if eager to expose everything: bank statements, loan agreements, receipts from casinos. All of them in my name. My chest tightened. "What is this?" Sophie looked straight at me. "Derek has a gambling addiction. The whole family, used your name to co-sign his debts. You didn't know, because they hid it too well." I touched the papers, feeling like I was holding hot coals. Every word, every number burned. "Why are you telling me this?" Sophie gave a faint, joyless smile. "Because I was once in your place. They drained my savings, forced me to stay quiet to protect the family's reputation. When I finally left, they called me ungrateful, smeared my name to our friends." She paused, her voice lowering. "I thought I had it bad, until I found out who you were." That sentence fell into the space between us, heavy as stone. I looked at Sophie, and for the first time, I saw not just pity in her eyes, but understanding. I folded the stack of papers, resting my hand on them as though holding a living piece of evidence. In my mind, scattered fragments of memory suddenly clicked together into a clear picture: why they were always in such a hurry for me to sign documents, why Derek never asked me for money directly but always had Lily or my parents do it for him. Sophie took the last sip of her coffee, then said quietly, "Don't think you're alone. They've destroyed too many people, and it's time we stop them." I tightened my grip on the envelope. For the first time in years, I felt I wasn't alone. And that was more dangerous to their family than anything else. The next day, I brought Sophie's envelope of documents to the office. Alex, my closest colleague, glanced at the stack of papers, then looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before, part concern, part calculation. "You need a lawyer. Not the kind who's just going to make a plea deal, but someone who knows how to turn every single word in here into a killing blow." I nodded. This was no longer about emotions. This was strategy. That afternoon, Alex introduced me to Attorney Hayes, a man in his early 40s, hair dusted with gray, voice deep like he was telling a story you couldn't walk away from. He read through Sophie's papers, then looked at me for a long moment. "If this is all you have, we have a case. But if you can get me more evidence, we'll turn this into a chessboard they can't escape from." So I started gathering everything. Bank statements covering 8 years. Loan contracts I'd been pressured into signing in a hurry. The recording of my parents, where they scolded me and admitted to exploiting me. Even the seemingly harmless text messages, I screenshotted and sorted into categories. Every piece went into a clear plastic sleeve, carefully labeled, then stacked into a thick file tied with a red string. Some nights, I stayed up sorting data until 2 in the morning. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper and the steady ticking of the clock. Each time I tightened another loop of red string around the file, it felt like I was building another wall between me and them. Right when everything was falling into place, I got a call from Aunt Grace, my father's younger sister. She was the only relative who had never borrowed money from me, but she had also never stepped into our family disputes. Her voice was soft, but I caught the careful undertone immediately. The day after tomorrow, we'll have a family meeting. Everyone says we should sit down and reconcile. Reconcile? I almost laughed. I knew exactly what reconciliation meant in their dictionary. It meant I'd drop my case before it even reached court, and everything would be buried under the usual "let's not embarrass the family." But this time, I wasn't walking into that room empty-handed. That night, Attorney Hayes and I went over the plan. The goal wasn't to convince them, it was to make them say, in their own voices, the very things that would destroy their own reputation. This time, I said, my eyes locked on the red tide file, I'm going to make them hear themselves shatter their own dignity. The next morning, I placed the file on my desk, closed the cover with both hands. The red string tightened, making a faint but solid rasp, like a quiet promise to myself, I was ready. The day of reckoning was getting close. And finally, the day arrived. I woke up early and chose a black suit I usually reserve for business trips, the kind of meetings where I'd face powerful clients. As I zipped up my coat, I caught my reflection in the mirror and realized, today, I wasn't going to lower my head for anyone. I was heading to the meeting with an unusual sense of ease, because this time, the scales would tip in my favor. Aunt Grace's living room that afternoon was bright with the midday sun, yet the air felt thick, like a storm trapped in a jar. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the dampness of coats still clinging to the morning frost as relatives filed in. The long wooden table in the center of the room was already full, chairs pushed close together. I recognized every face, uncles who once called me odd, aunts who chuckled whenever someone brought up the fact that I was still unmarried. Some looked at me with indifferent eyes, others smirked like they were about to watch a show. I caught a man's voice from the far end of the table, whispering to the person next to him, "Let's see what kind of act she's putting on today." A short, sharp chuckle followed, slicing through the air like a blade. Aunt Grace, in a beige cardigan, emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of tea and pastries. She smiled at me, but I could see the cautious glint behind it. Once everyone had settled into their seats, she spoke softly, "We're here to find a way to reconcile." I pulled out my chair, sat down, and set the red tide file folder on the table. The faint scrape of the string against the cover made everyone fall silent. I glanced around, then said each word with precision. I didn't come here to apologize. I came here to set things straight, and I'll only say this once. I untied the string and opened the folder. Sunlight from the window hit the pages, making them almost glare white. I slid the first set of documents to the center of the table, bank statements, loan agreements bearing my signature, signatures I'd been pressured into, and casino receipts, all in my name. Derek, sitting at the far end, had started out leaning back with a careless air, but now he was upright, hands clasped tight. My parents exchanged a quick, uneasy glance, while Lily stared down at the table, her shoulders trembling. I went on, my voice calm but every word landing like a stone on the polished wood. These are the text messages asking me to swipe my card to cover debts. And this is a recording of my call with my parents. I placed the recorder on the table and pressed play. My parents' voices filled the room, undeniable, every insult, every admission that they had taken advantage of me. The air seemed to sink, the only other sound the faint static from the speaker. An aunt sitting near Derek gave a short, derisive laugh and shook her head. My God, who would have thought? Another whispered, "It's a shame," but who told her to trust people like that? Across from me, a cousin looked at me with a new expression, not contempt, but respect, with maybe a flicker of silent encouragement. My father cleared his throat, trying to recover. Family doesn't keep score like this. I locked eyes with him, unblinking. What is family if it only takes and never gives back? The question hit the room like someone had cut the power. Lily broke into sobs, covering her face. Derek shot to his feet, his chair tipping over, and strode out without a word. The door slammed, rattling the frame, and a few teacups on the table trembled. Someone muttered, "Smart move," walking away. Another, voice tinged with sarcasm, at least he kept up the tough act till the end. I didn't answer any of it. Instead, I gathered the documents and slid them neatly back into the folder. The cover closed, the red string tightened, making a faint but firm scrape, like locking away the burden I'd carried for far too long. I stood, the weight on my shoulders easing even as fatigue crept in. Not everyone in that room would believe me or take my side. But for the first time, I knew one thing: I was no longer alone. But victory comes with a price. 3 days after the family meeting, the news began to spread. I wasn't the one to say anything more, but the words and evidence from that day found their own way into other people's ears. My father's company received an anonymous complaint with the audio recording attached. Just a week later, he was dismissed for serious violations of the Code of Ethics. Derek's situation was even worse. The loans in my name triggered an official investigation. The police uncovered his connection to several illegal betting rings. One evening, as I was just arriving home, I saw a police car parked in front of Derek's apartment and 2 uniformed officers leading him away. His face was pale, his eyes swept over me, but there was no defiance left, only fear and exhaustion. Lily chose a different way. She sent me a handwritten letter, but not to apologize. The scrawled, angry words accused me of destroying the family and threatened to never forgive me. I finished reading, folded it, slipped it into another envelope, and put it in a drawer, neither burning it nor tearing it up, just leaving it there, another piece of evidence from the past I would never touch again. From that day on, I blocked all their phone numbers, emails, and social media accounts. Not out of fear, but because I knew I needed absolute distance to start over. A week later, I submitted a request to transfer to the Seattle branch. When my department head asked why, I simply smiled. I need a new place to replant myself. On my last day in the old apartment, I stood in the living room, looking at the wall where a family photo from a Christmas years ago used to hang. In the picture, everyone was smiling, but now I knew those smiles had been constructed to hide far too much. I took the photo down. The wall was left with a rectangular patch, paler than the surrounding paint. I held the wooden frame, removed the picture, and hung the empty frame back in its original place. The morning light streamed in, reflecting off the smooth glass surface, casting a thin band of brightness like a horizon line. I stood there for a long time, my fingertips brushing the edge of the frame. I'm leaving this empty space here to remind myself, not every void needs to be filled. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. I turned away, picked up my bag and keys. The door closed behind me, and I knew I had left the past inside that room. A year later, Seattle welcomed me with clear blue skies and the scent of sea salt weaving its way into every morning. My new apartment sat on the 3rd floor of a small building overlooking the bay, where, whenever I opened the window, the sound of waves breaking against the rocks rose and fell like a steady breath. The empty picture frame I had brought from my old apartment still hung in the center of the living room wall, still empty, still reflecting the shifting light throughout the day. That afternoon, I sat at a seaside cafe with Daniel, the man who had entered my life as gently as rippling waves, yet as patient and steady as the tide. He set his cappuccino down on the table, looking at me with curiosity tinged with hesitation. "You didn't invite your family?" I smiled. Not the strained, evasive kind of smile, but a real one, light, like when you know you're standing exactly where you belong. I shook my head slightly. I already have a family, right here. I didn't need to point for Daniel to understand what right here meant. It was his hand resting warmly on mine across the table. It was the new friends I'd made in Seattle, the evenings we spent cooking together and laughing until we lost track of time. It was myself, a woman who had learned how to set boundaries without feeling guilty. The waves outside kept rolling in, each one carrying away a little more of the heaviness I had carried for years. I realized family was no longer a group of people tied to me by blood, but those who respected me, kept me safe, and never demanded I sacrifice my dignity in exchange for acceptance. That evening, when I returned to my apartment, I opened the window to let the warm amber of the sunset fill the room. The empty frame on the wall caught a long streak of light, like a horizon wrapping around the entire space. I stepped closer, let my fingers graze the smooth glass, and whispered to myself, "Family is not a reason to give up your dignity and your peace." I knew there would still be days when I'd have to explain, or face judgmental looks from people who didn't understand the story. But I also knew, I had stood up, I had walked away, and I had chosen a life with no room for silent endurance. If you've ever had to set boundaries with your family to protect yourself, I hope you know that it doesn't make you love them any less, it just means you love yourself enough not to abandon who you are. Dear friend, and if you see a piece of your own story in mine, share your experience in the comments below. Hit subscribe to keep walking with me through more stories not just about pain, but about how we heal and reclaim our peace, even if it means leaving behind the people we once called family.